ready or not? We're going to begin by reading responsively some words of the great 20th century theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. His words are at number 461 in the hymnal. We must be saved. Nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we are saved by hope.
Nothing true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history.
Therefore, we are saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love.
No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as from our own.
Therefore, we are saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. God of grace and God of glory is our first hymn, number 115.
Amen.
words of our unison affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. So be it.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the First Parish in Bedford, an old church for a new world. Welcome to new visitors and to old friends. Here in this church, human beings have gathered since 1729, seeking a higher purpose and deeper life than they could find alone. Here, the ordinary is sanctified, the human is celebrated, the compassionate is at hand. Our unity is in our diversity, and you are welcomed wholly and completely, just as you are. If you're with us for the first time today, I invite you to fill out a little blue connection card that you can find in your pew. You could leave it in the collection basket later during the service. Following the service, you are all very welcome to come back through the doors behind me and head into the common room for community hour. There's also to be a service discussion upstairs in the bacon room, and we hope many or all might join us. I guess all would be a little crowded, in which case we'll move it into here. This weekend we are honoring Veterans Day and all those who served our country. And we welcome very, very wholeheartedly our guest speaker, Andrew Bacevich, retired colonel in the U.S. Army and professor emeritus of history and international relations at Boston University. You're going to hear a little bit more about him and a bigger welcome and introduction in a moment from John Gibbons and Brian Hart. The auction was terrific last night. Lots of folks were there. Kath Van Prague, Amy Lloyd, Dawn LaFrance Linden, and Delcy Sherrill worked so hard behind the scenes to make it all come together. Dorothy Perales and Amy Signorello were fabulous auctioneers. All the senior youth who helped out, thank you so much. There were tons of donors, volunteers, and attendees. Thank you to everyone who supported it, both online and in person. The numbers aren't quite in yet, but hold onto your hats. We were able to raise over $18,000 for First Parish. I think that may be our biggest number yet. It's just great that we were all in it together. If you haven't yet picked up an item that you won, we have a bill pay and pick up in the common room after the service, along with a few lovely items that are still for sale, and we hope that people will buy them. In the back of your order of service, you'll find an announcement section. Next week is our annual Thanksgiving service. Our youth choirs will sing, we'll celebrate the season, and we'll also have an opportunity to welcome new members. If you feel that this place has become your spiritual home and you're ready to sign our membership book, you could reach out to John or me. And after the service next week, the membership committee is hosting a quiche and tell event. This is to welcome all folks who are new and new-ish to the church in the last year or two. It's a way to get more connected with what's going on and hear a little bit from people who've been here a long time. And it's all right if you are not a member and you're sort of newish, you can come to that. We'd love you to come to that. But we do hope to have a few more members to sign before next week so we can welcome you up here. Also coming up this week, we had last week a great meditation and mindfulness for stressful times evening. It was a little time together led by our own Julie Gillette, and that will be coming up again for the second time, Wednesday, this coming Wednesday from 7 to 8:30. And I think we're up to a time for all ages, unless you're going to welcome. Are you welcome? Come on up, John. You're going to do a time for, thank you, welcome one and all, and now a time for all ages.
So, as Megan says, we are recognizing veterans this weekend, and would you raise your hand if you had family members who served in the American Revolution? Yes, there are some hands. All right. Now, raise your hands if you had family members at the time of the Civil War. Quite a few. And just jumping ahead, How many of you had family members who served during the First or Second World Wars? How many of you personally served, say, in the Second World War? One very youthful hand. All right, now let's move up to Korea and the Cold War and Vietnam, family members who served at that time. And you personally, how many of you personally served at that time? There are some hands. And so now we'll move up to the Gulf War and the so-called wars on terror, family members who served at those occasions. And you personally served. And there are at least some hands, but very few hands. And the point I want to make is that it used to be that almost everyone, men and women, served in whatever way they could in support of our military, in support of our wars, in service to our country. But as time has gone along, we as a country have tended to have other people serve rather than ourselves. It's a little bit like getting somebody to mow the grass or do the laundry or cook our food or clean the house. How many of you have at one time or another cut the grass or cleaned your laundry or cooked your food? Yes. When there are important things that need to be done, it is important that everyone participate. They call that having skin in the game, having skin in the game. It would be a worse world if we were not to, at some times, clean our own homes and cut our own grass and do our own laundry and cook our own food. And when we have other people serving our country and putting their lives at risk in ways we may not even know about, we may not even know who they are or where they are serving, when that happens, it is at our common peril and danger. All for one and one for all. And kids and teachers are about to go to your classes, and as they do, staying seated, we'll sing our sanctuary song and get a little leadership from the choir on singing that through twice. These are the words of James Baldwin. It is rare indeed that people give. Most people guard and keep. They suppose that it is they themselves and what they identify with themselves that they are guarding and keeping, whereas they are actually guarding and keeping their system of reality and what they assume themselves to be. One can give nothing whatever without giving oneself. That is to say, risking oneself. If one cannot risk oneself, then one is simply incapable of giving. Freely we have received, freely give. For the good work of this congregation within and far, far beyond these walls, our morning offering will gratefully be received. So I'm going to introduce Brian, and Brian will then introduce Andrew. We began this service reading words written by one of the greatest of 20th century theologians, Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr is best known for the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I have to tell you that there is another Niebuhr quote which I like just as well. He said, "I think there ought to be a club in which preachers and journalists could come together and have the sentimentalism of the one matched with the cynicism of the other. That ought to bring them pretty close to the truth." Niebuhr's wisdom and influence, however, are far deeper than any quotation. Both Andrew Bacevich and Brian Hart are Niebuhrian, though I am rather confident that that description would never, ever occur to Brian. On the other hand, when I tried to find a short description of Niebuhr, the most succinct I could find comes from Bacevich in his book, The Limits of Power, in which he said, "Even today, Niebuhr deserves recognition as the most clear-eyed of American prophets. He warned that what he called our dreams of managing history, born of a peculiar combination of arrogance and narcissism, pose a potentially mortal threat to the United States. Today, we ignore that warning at our peril." Bacevich wrote that in 2008. And he continues, "Niebuhr entertained few illusions about the nature of man, the possibilities of politics, or the pliability of history. Global economic crisis, total war, genocide, totalitarianism, and nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization itself. He viewed all of these with an unblinking eye that allowed no room for hypocrisy, hokum, or self-deception. Realism and humility formed the core of Niebuhr's worldview, each infused with a deeply felt Christian sensibility." 9 years ago from this pulpit, Brian and I began a campaign to support our troops who cannot speak freely for themselves. We began a campaign to speak out, not a simplistic campaign to speak out for peace, not an anti-war or a pro-war campaign. It is a campaign to speak out for truth. We want the truth about war and military service and democracy. As it says on the wayside pulpit in front of this church, if we were to remain silent, we would be complicit. As New England meeting houses such as this one were the crucible of American democracy, and as the Minutemen once mustered on this Bedford Common, so too we must muster for democracy and for truth. Brian is not here to shill for any orthodoxy, party, or ideology. He has no tolerance for arrogance or narcissism, hypocrisy, hokum, or self-deception. Brian rarely raises his voice. He's neither sentimental nor cynical. He's here to support our troops with truth. When Brian's father died as a result of a pharmaceutical error, Brian invented a system of barcoding to prevent such future deaths. When, in an unarmored Humvee, John Hart was killed in action in Iraq, Brian invented robots to dismantle roadside IEDs, and as importantly, Brian and Alma initiated a campaign to learn the truth about conditions in which we ask our troops to fight, the scandal of inadequate armor, and the persistence of official dissembling and deceit. I would describe Brian as a courageous man, a humble, clear-eyed Niebuhrian prophet in pursuit of truth. But in deference to John Hart, to Travis Desiato, to Andrew Bacevich Jr., and to all who have paid so dearly, Brian would reject such honorifics. No one, he says, is shooting at him. Please welcome Brian Hart.
Christ, I can't live up to that. I was just going to say it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Bacevich, and a historian of American foreign diplomatic and military history, a PhD in American diplomatic history from Princeton, a teacher at West Point and Johns Hopkins, professor emeritus of international relations and history at Boston University, career Army officer, retiring at the rank of colonel with service in the Middle East, Vietnam, and elsewhere. On this Veterans Day weekend, Dr. Bacevich could be at a lot of places, but he graciously accepted our invitation to speak at First Parish Church in Bedford, Massachusetts, during the 200th anniversary of this building. In 1775, about 40% of the adult male population of Bedford turned out for battle, the outcome of which was most doubtful. Today, 242 years later, the scales of justice continue to tip and swing precariously, a measure of democracy teetering in the balance, ready to spill out. Except every day, average Americans choose to defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America against enemies, foreign and domestic, and in doing so, steady the scales with clutching hand, just enough to hold the balance for another day. Today, this great Veterans Day weekend, in the 288th year of our congregation, I would speak in remembrance of Lieutenant Andrew John Bacevich, son of my friend, who died in combat in Iraq. It has been our family's honor to know the Baceviches 10 years hence. Andrew has reacquainted me with the now famous Reinhold Niebuhr, a great American theologian of a different era. Niebuhr said that it is the sad duty of politics to establish justice in a sinful world, with democracy finding proximate solutions to insoluble problems. Ironically, this week we learn that Mr. John Comey, fired head of the FBI, used Reinhold Niebuhr as his secret Twitter handle. Dr. Bacevich has penned a series of books and articles on American foreign policy that, in my opinion, have made him the decade's foremost thinker in the field. A moral man grappling with immoral times. Please welcome Dr. Bacevich.
Well, I'm grateful for the eloquent introduction and for both of your eloquent presentations. I'll begin with a quotation from an American prophet, but it's not going to be Reinhold Niebuhr. It's going to be James Baldwin, almost as if we coordinated this thing. So Baldwin once wrote the following: "In America, life seems to move faster than anywhere else on the globe, and each generation is promised more than it will get, which creates in each generation a furious, bewildered rage, the rage of people who cannot find solid ground beneath their feet. So that's Baldwin back in 1955 in his book, Notes of a Native Son. And my aim this morning, I'll probably talk for about 20-25 minutes. My aim this morning in the first year of the so-called Age of Trump is to persuade you that the diagnosis that Baldwin offered back in 1955 remains apt today. That the essential problem we confront in our present crisis is our inability to find solid ground beneath our feet, with many of our fellow citizens expressing their bewildered, furious rage by electing Donald Trump president. In short, at least in my view, Trump is not the problem. He is merely symptom or consequence of several problems that existed long before he appeared on the political scene and that developments in recent decades have served to exacerbate. It's long been my view that we pay way too much attention to presidents, and that is surely the case with this one. For too long, the cult of the presidency has provided an excuse for treating politics as if it were some kind of a melodrama, staged at 4-year intervals, and centering on hopes that another Roosevelt or Kennedy or Reagan will appear on the scene as the agent of American deliverance. And truly, Donald Trump's ascent to the office, once inhabited by such worthies, should demolish such fantasies once and for all. My own bet, and I know this is a minority opinion, my own bet is that Donald Trump will turn out to be the least significant president in recent memory. That is, he will, assuming he avoids blundering into a major war, and that's a big assumption. But if he does manage to steer clear of a major war, Trump will prove to be what Millard Fillmore was to the 19th century, or Warren G. Harding was to the 20th century. To be sure, in the meantime, Donald Trump routinely says or tweets innumerable things that qualify as inane or reprehensible. And he has done and proposes to do more than a few things that are wrong-headed. But little of what he does is irreversible. And should Trump's successor demonstrate a modicum of competence and decency, again, that's an assumption, then it seems to me that most of the damage that Trump has wreaked can be undone. To my mind, one of the most striking aspects of the Trump presidency is the gap between rhetoric and action, and that gap is huge. Trump likes to pose as a bold leader, making big decisions that will make America great again. In practice, however, his decisions tend to be small bore. Whenever possible, he dodges the central issue or offloads responsibility for that particular subject onto the Congress or onto the military. We've seen this time and again on trade, on NATO, on the conduct of the Afghanistan war, on the DACA issue. I see nothing to suggest that Trump is hell-bent on leading us down a path to fascism. Doing so would require a sense of purpose that Trump shows no signs of possessing. So what then explains the rage of the people who cannot find solid ground beneath their feet and who express their dismay by electing Donald Trump president? Well, you can blame sexism, Fox News, James Comey, Russian meddling, and Hillary's failure to visit Wisconsin, all you want, but a more fundamental explanation in my mind is this. The election of 2016 constituted a de facto referendum on the course of recent U.S. history. And that referendum rendered a definitive judgment. The underlying consensus informing basic U.S. policy since the Cold War has now collapsed. And precepts that members of the policy elite have long treated as self-evident have no longer command the backing or the assent of the American people. That's what happened in November of 2016. Put simply, it's the ideas stupid, the ideals that failed and now have been rejected. So those who imagine that Trump's removal will itself put things right are deluding themselves. And to persist in that kind of thinking, in thinking that Trump defines the problem, is, in my judgment, to commit an error of the first order. Here's another quote. Without the Cold War, what's the point of being an American? Now, as the long twilight struggle was winding down, Harry Rabbit Angstrom, novelist John Updike's late 20th century everyman, Rabbit Angstrom pondered that question. Without the Cold War, what's the point of being an American? Well, in short order, Rabbit got his answer, and so did his fellow citizens, us, albeit with only perfunctory consultation. Now, the passing of the Cold War offered cause for celebration. On that point, everyone agreed. Yet, as it turned out, the passing of the Cold War did not require reflection, nor regret, nor repentance on the part of the United States, although it ought to have. As to what would come next, well, in such matters, policy elites, the people who exercise influence in Washington, D.C., they profess to have matters well in hand. The dawning era, they believe, the post-Cold War era, summoned Americans not to think anew, but to keep doing precisely what they were accustomed to doing, albeit now without having to fret further about communist takeovers or the risks of nuclear Armageddon. In a world where a sole superpower, remember that phrase came into use as the Cold War ended, in a world where a sole superpower was calling the shots, utopia beckoned just around the corner. All that was needed, they believed, and we were told, all that was needed was for the United States to demonstrate the requisite confidence and resolve. Three specific propositions comprised this elite consensus that coalesced during the first decade of the post-Cold War era. According to the first of those ideas, the globalization of corporate capitalism held the key to wealth creation on a hitherto unimaginable scale. According to the second of those propositions, jettisoning norms derived from Judeo-Christian religious traditions held the key to the further expansion and indeed the perfection of human freedom. And according to the third of those propositions, muscular global leadership exercised by the United States held the key to promoting a stable and humane international order. So unfettered neoliberalism, plus the unencumbered self, plus unabashed American assertiveness. These define the elements of the post-Cold War consensus that formed during the first half of the 1990s. These plus what enthusiasts called the information revolution. The miracle of that revolution, gathering momentum just as the Soviet Union was going down for the count, provided in a sense the secret sauce that infused the emerging consensus with a sense of historical inevitability. Now, the Cold War itself, running from the late 1940s through the 1980s, had fostered notable improvements in computational speed and capacity. During those decades, new modes of communication appeared, along with new techniques for storing, accessing, and manipulating information. Yet, however impressive those developments during the Cold War, only as the Cold War receded did they move from the background to the forefront. For true believers, information technology served a quasi-theological function, promising answers to life's ultimate questions. Although God might be dead, Americans found in Bill Gates and Steve Jobs nerdy but nonetheless compelling idols. More immediately, in the eyes of the policy elite, the information revolution meshed with and reinforced the new policy consensus. For those focused on political economy, the information revolution greased the wheels of globalized capitalism, creating vast new opportunities for trade and investment. For those looking to shed constraints on personal freedom, information promised empowerment, making identity itself something to choose, to discard, or to modify. And for members of the national security apparatus, the information revolution seemed certain to endow the United States with seemingly unassailable military capabilities. That these various enhancements would combine to improve the human condition was taken for granted. That they would in due course align everybody from Afghans to Zimbabweans with American values and the American way of life seemed more or less inevitable. So the three presidents of the post-Cold War era, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, put these several propositions to the test. Now, politics as theater requires us to pretend that our 42nd, 43rd, and 44th presidents differed in fundamental ways. In practice, however, their similarities greatly outweighed their differences. Taken together, the administrations over which they presided collaborated in pursuing a common agenda, each intent on proving that the post-Cold War consensus could work, even in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. And to be fair, it did work for some. Globalization did make some people very rich indeed. In doing so, however, it greatly exacerbated inequality while doing nothing to alleviate the condition of the American working class and underclass. All the emphasis on diversity and multiculturalism did improve the status of groups long subjected to discrimination. Yet those advances have done remarkably little to reduce the alienation and despair pervading a society suffering from an epidemic of chronic substance abuse, morbid obesity, teen suicide, and similar afflictions. Throw in the world's highest incarceration rate, a seemingly insatiable appetite for pornography, urban school systems stuck in permanent crisis, and mass shootings that occur with metronomic regularity, and what you have is something other than the profile of a healthy society. As for militarized American global leadership, it has indeed resulted in various bad actors meeting richly deserved fates. Yet it has also embroiled the United States in a series of costly, senseless, unsuccessful, and ultimately counterproductive wars. As for the vaunted information revolution, its impact has been ambiguous at best, even if those with eyeballs glued to their personal electronic device can't tolerate being offline long enough to assess the actual costs of being perpetually connected. Well, in November of 2016, a year ago, Americans who considered themselves ill-served by the post-Cold War consensus signaled that they had had enough. Voters who concluded that neoliberal economic policies, a culture taking its motto from the Outback Steakhouse chain, and the conversion of the U.S. military into a global police force, those convinced that those arrangements were not working to their benefit, they provided the crucial margin in electing Donald Trump president. And the response of the political establishment to this extraordinary repudiation, I think, testifies to the bankruptcy of that establishment. The Republican Party still clings to the notion that reducing taxes, cutting government red tape, restricting abortion, curbing immigration, prohibiting flag burning, and increasing military spending will alleviate all that ails our country. And to judge by the promises contained in their so-called better deal that was unveiled a few weeks ago and was instantly forgotten, Democrats believe that raising the minimum wage, capping the cost of prescription drugs, and creating apprenticeship programs for the unemployed will return their party to the good graces of the American electorate. My point is that in both parties, embarrassingly small-bore thinking prevails. Both parties being equally bereft of fresh ideas. Each party is led by aging hacks. I cannot decide which person I loathe more, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell. Neither party has devised an antidote to the crises of American politics, to the crisis of American politics, signified by the nomination and election of Donald Trump. While our emperor tweets, Rome itself fiddles. Now, I am by temperament a conservative and a traditionalist, wary of revolutionary movements that more often than not end up being hijacked by nefarious plotters more interested in satisfying their own ambitions than in pursuing high ideals. Yet even I am prepared to admit that the status quo appears increasingly untenable. Incremental change is not likely to suffice. I think the challenge of the moment, I suspect it's a challenge that Niebuhr himself would recognize, is to embrace radicalism without succumbing to irresponsibility. I think the one good thing we can say about the election of Donald Trump is this: to borrow an image from Thomas Jefferson, it may well serve as a fire bell in the night, curing Americans once and for all of the illusion that from the White House comes redemption. By now, we really ought to have had enough of de facto monarchy. And by extension, Americans should come to see as intolerable the meanness, corruption, and dysfunction so much in evidence at the opposite end of Pennsylvania Avenue. We need not wax sentimental about the days when Lyndon Johnson and Everett Dirksen presided over the Senate to conclude that people like McConnell and Chuck Schumer represent something other than progress. If Congress continues to behave as contemptibly as it has in recent weeks and months, it will by default allow the conditions that have produced Trump and his cronies to prevail. So it's time to take another stab at an approach to governance worthy of a democratic republic. Well, where to begin? I submit that Rabbit Angstrom's question offers a place to start. What's the point of being an American? Now, there are many ways of answering Rabbit's question, and my own answer is rooted in an abiding conviction that our problems are less quantitative than qualitative. Rather than simply more, yet more wealth, yet more freedom, yet more attempts at global leadership, the times call for different. In my view, the point of being an American is to participate in creating a society that strikes a balance between wants and needs, that exists in harmony with nature and the rest of humankind, and that is rooted in an agreed-upon conception of the common good. That last, a phrase from my youth that has all but disappeared from political discourse. Now, people of goodwill are likely to differ on how to fulfill such aspirations. But therein lies the basis for an interesting debate, one that is essential to prospects of stemming the accelerating decay of American civic life. Yet the beginning of wisdom lies in recognizing that Trump is not cause but consequence. A post-Cold War consensus that promoted transnational corporate greed, mistook libertinism for liberty, and embraced militarized neo-imperialism as the essence of enlightened statecraft, that consensus created the conditions that handed Trump the presidency. And devising an alternative has now become an urgent priority. Thank you very much.
We will regroup upstairs in the room overlooking the common for conversation with Dr. Bacevich. He did bring along a carton of this book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, at a significant discount, which we'll have available. And we'll sing. Our concluding hymn is Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. It's number 126. Let's do this call and response. Repeat after me. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. May it be so.